right, welcome back, everybody. Good to be with you guys as usual. Just getting the video started here for ethics. So, welcome back to our new installment. We are now continuing on a new course unit that we began in the previous lecture. So, we've moved from ethical theory to the ethics of abortion, to a brief little interlude with genetic engineering, human cloning, and the moral issues raised by that. And now we are onto the topic of war, terrorism, and torture, exploring the moral complexity of the issue of war and related matters like terrorism and torture to see, is there any argument that can give moral justification for these things? Are they always wrong? Are they okay in some conditions and not others? We've focused so far on our discussions of war out of those three. So just a little review. Obviously, war is morally problematic on its face because it involves terrible things like killing and loss of life and destruction of property and use of resources, even environmental devastation. All these things are caused by war or are at least byproducts of war. So is there anything that can justify these things morally or not? There were three major positions on the ethics of war, which we talked about last time as well. So just briefly, in summary, one position was the realist view, realism. According to that view, there's no such thing as morality when it comes to war. War, the only reasonable questions that could be asked, according to the realist, are whether a given action advances the aims of the state, not whether the action was morally permitted or not. They see these outbreaks of war as almost on par with natural disasters, therefore depriving them of any kind of moral valence, positive or negative, even if they're unfortunate. And then another theory, but by the way, many people would oppose realism on the grounds that, even in war, certainly some kind of moral standards, even very basic ones, should still prevail. Aren't there atrocities that can be done in war? Aren't there ways of conducting war that are more or less honorable? Okay, anti-war pacifism is like the polar opposite of that. To the anti-war pacifists, war is never morally permissible. So all wars are wrong, and all participation in war is wrong. They may think that there's a sacred right to life that is violated in war, and that's why it's wrong. Or the pacifist may say that it's because war, on balance, always produces more total harm than benefit. But of course, those points could be opposed as well. Somebody could say that war, at least in some cases, might have created enough positive results to overcome the weight of all the harm. And in other cases, someone might say that if it's the right to life that's being appealed to by the pacifist and holding them on that position, then wouldn't the same right to life justify you in taking whatever needed actions that could prevent an even greater destruction of loss of life? And then there was just war theory, which is an interesting, much discussed intermediate position between those other two. According to the just war theory, it's not that all wars are wrong, nor that they're always permissible, but that it just depends. Some wars are morally permissible, so says the just war theory, but it depends on whether that given war can satisfy specified criteria that the theory lays out. Now, we kind of finished by going into more depth about that third position, the just war theory, and we noticed that it has got, first of all, a famous author that originally framed the discussion about it. That's St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived way back in the 13th century. And in his discussion, he divides the principles of just war into two sets. The just ad bellum conditions, those are the conditions that would have to be met for the initiation of war to be morally permissible. And then there's the just in bello conditions, which are the requirements that should be met if the conduct inside of the war is going to be morally permitted. And we went over all the different conditions. There's quite a few of them. So there are 6 just ad bellum conditions and 2 just in bello conditions for a total of 8. First, considering the just ad bellum conditions, the ones that need to be met for the starting of war or the launching of war to be acceptable. So there was legitimate authority. Basically, you have to have official heads of state or people that are empowered through some kind of political process to represent the interests of a political community. Those are the kinds of people that have to launch the war, not private citizens nor spontaneous uprisings. Another condition was the just cause requirement. That's very central to the description of the just war theory. Just cause means that you have to be waging the war for a morally acceptable reason, and generally that is self-defense. but we also talked about how there are some debates around what constitutes an act of self-defense. The purest case, of course, would be that you're retaliating against an attack already made against you or your nation. Preventive, let's say actually preemptive first. A preemptive definition of self-defense would allow that it could be you have not yet been struck, but you see an imminent attack headed your way, so you attack in advance. And then preventive is a little even more controversial, which tries to make the case that even if there are, some way distant in time threats that are gathering, then even that could be in some larger extended sense self-defensive. But anyway, it's got to be a just cause. It can't be for purposes of greed, conquest, empire, or genocide, or any of those things. Okay, another condition was the third, right intention, which means that you have to have righteous motivations as you're doing this war. So your only motive should be to get back to peace and the peaceful status quo, not to use the just cause as an excuse to wage the war for other less noble purposes like empire, conquest, or resources. And then there's a few more. There was last resort. That one is easy to explain. It just means that you have to try all other non-military measures first. If those all fail, then it becomes the last resort. So this makes sure it's not a war of choice, but necessity. Then there was the proportionality requirement. This is sometimes called within the jus ad bellum column, the political proportionality requirement, because it requires the political heads of state to make prospective judgments about how much total harm and good the war will cause. So they have to be able to make a reasonable judgment that it will cause at least as much good or more than the harm that the same war causes. So the benefits derived from the war should outweigh or at least equal the weight of the costs. And then there's the reasonable chance of success condition. That's the last. That just is as it says. You have to have a reasonable chance to come out victorious and win. Otherwise, it would be futile to fight the war, even if you were justified on every other basis. So then there were two jus in bello conditions. Just quickly, one of them was the discrimination principle, which says that you have to make all active attempts to distinguish between legitimate military targets and non-combatants, and never deliberately, at least, attack the non-combatants. And then the second condition of jus in bello is the military proportionality requirement, which says that you should not use more force than is necessary to achieve a given mission or objective. So you should use the least force that is consistent with successfully achieving the mission, but not use disproportionate force than is needed. Okay. Now, after that, I just have a few more things to say as an introduction of the topic of war, terrorism, and torture. And then we'll make a quick transition into the author, the first author in the three-author series on this topic, and that's going to be Douglas Lackey. But next, I want to say a few things about terrorism, which is the second, subject area we're looking at. So again, just to kind of give us something to look at visually, we are now entering our discussion again of war, terrorism, and torture. So we started with some introductory statements about different moral beliefs about war, and then we spelled out the just war theory in, I think, pretty good detail. Let's move on and speak just for a bit about the terrorism component of this unit. So most of us probably feel like we know what an act of terrorism is when we see it. There have been, of course, some unfortunate terrorist attacks even in our own country, whether it's 9/11 or the Boston Marathon bombing at the finish line or the Oklahoma City bombing back in the 90s, just to name a few. And abroad, we've seen similar things. 7/7 double-decker bus bombing in London, Mumbai terrorist attacks. But we wanted to just try to not to only point to examples, but to give a general definition that groups all the examples under a common concept. So what general features do all these different examples share? It cannot be too broad, or else it would include things that are not intuitively acts of terrorism. If you just said it's an action involving violence, then maybe that could be the same as bank robbery, but doesn't strike the mind as though that's a real case of terrorism. It also can't be so narrow so as to restrict the definition to those that are non-state actors, because it seems intuitive that the state in some cases could commit terrorism as well as an individual could. So the definition given by our textbook editor is this. I'll put it here in the little written out typed chat. So they define terrorism in this way in our textbook anyway. Terrorism, the deliberate use or threat of physical violence against non-combatants And then they talk about the motive to advance specific goals. So to advance either political, religious, or ideological aims. Okay, so that's the editor Lewis Vaughn's chosen definition, that it's the deliberate use or at least threat of physical violence. Now, importantly, in his definition, it specifies that it's got to be directed against non-combatants. So if you were just attacking military targets in war, that's just legitimate warfare. But if you're using, force and violence to attack people that are not engaged in hostilities, like just innocent civilians, and you're doing it to advance some kind of goal, whether it's political, religious, or maybe just ideological agenda, trying to promote and advance that goal through the attack on innocent people that are not fighting. Now, there are different definitions of terrorism that certain different authors utilize. So for now, just letting you know, this is the one that our editor gives, but one of the authors that we will read later, Andrew Valls, he has a slightly different definition that he argues for, and so we'll see how we can compare the two. But for now, we're using this as our base definition. And in the sense defined here, terrorism has a pretty long history. It includes not just modern day cases of terrorism, but religious wars of conquest, some actions that were taken, for example, during the Crusades or during the French Revolution. Nationalist terrorism had been committed in the 19th and in the 20th century. We saw state-sponsored terrorism, like the Nazis trying to exterminate Jewish people, and more. Now, a question could be raised, is it possible for terrorism to be even theoretically morally justifiable in any case? Now, I'm sure most all of us have pretty strong feelings, including me, that there's no real basic moral defense that could be given of terrorist attacks. But some people at least raise the possibility on theoretical grounds that from a utilitarian point of view, maybe you could argue that the benefits achieved by the action outweigh the evil and the harm done by the act. So according to that view, the loss of innocent life of the victims would be overcompensated for by whatever benefits that would be derived from the act itself. But some people say terrorism could be justified also in the same way as the just war theory allows warfare to be justified. We'll circle back to that later when we read the Andrew Valls article, but he makes that case explicitly. He says that if you accept just war theory, it's possible for some cases of terrorist violence to satisfy the various requirements of the just war theory. But it's a kind of uphill battle for him to make that argument, because he's going to have to justify how a given act of terrorism could satisfy all the different requirements of the theory. And it's not clear, at least not initially, how it could satisfy some of them. Fundamentally, terrorism seems to specifically violate many of the conditions. For example, one that seems to be violated is legitimate authority. People who organize and engage in terrorist organizations, even the leadership, they don't seem to represent a political community or nation state. So can they, satisfy that requirement? Maybe through an argument that could be given, we could see why or why not. But at least at first, it seems questionable. You could wonder whether or not there's ever a realistic chance of success, at least depending on the example, whether that terrorist organization could foreseeably achieve its goal through a campaign of violence. And I think the most obviously violated one would be the discrimination principle, which says that you have to always make sure not to try and deliberately attack non-combatants. And at least according to the way this author defines it, the editor, Lewis Vaughn, it would seem that almost by definition, terrorism violates that condition, because according to this way of putting it, it's always directed at the non-combatants, or at least generally it is. So it would seem that it discriminates in exactly the wrong way, attacking on purpose the people you're supposed to try not to hurt. But anyway, we'll come back to that later. And I just also want to make a brief point about torture, the third item here on this list. So like terrorism, torture is probably easier to identify by examples than to give a general definition. There's obviously a lot of very nasty and disgusting actions that could fill the space of the definition of torture. In the book, they give just a couple of examples. Burning with hot iron, burning at the stake, electric shock treatment, cutting off parts of the body, severe beatings, suspending a person by their legs with their arms tied behind their back, putting on thumb screws, putting needles under fingernails, drilling through teeth with no anesthesia, making a person crouch for hours in an uncomfortable position, waterboarding, denying food, water, or sleep for days or weeks. So all those things kind of fill, out a general idea of what we think torturous acts are. But what's a definition that can somehow unify all the examples into a common theme? Well, the one that's given in our book again, so I'll put it here, torture, would be intentionally inflicting severe pain or suffering on a person. So we'll start with that. And then they talk about the purposes. For purposes of coercion, punishment, intimidation, or extraction of info. You see it there defined in that way, intentionally, meaning it's not an accident or somehow not aware of what you did, deliberately inflicting severe pain or suffering on a person. Why though? To maybe coerce them, meaning force them to do something they wouldn't otherwise do, maybe to punish them if they're like somehow accountable for something wrong they did, torturing them as a method of punishment. Sometimes it would be to intimidate, to send a message maybe to other people that torture is coming if you cross certain lines or maybe oppose certain authority. And then maybe another case could be extracting information. Someone's in custody, you think they are withholding info that might be vitally important, and torture is used as a means to get them to be more willing to share that information. So torture's been with humanity as a government tool for hundreds of years. In medieval times, it was legal to use it in Europe and that to acquire evidence, which they called back then judicial torture. But the modernizing, civilizing movement in the West has kind of led to that being fully abolished in the 18th century and going forward. But today, torture is condemned throughout the world. Nonetheless, it's still used in certain regimes, including some of those that officially reject it, or that at least on paper reject it. In international law, we have several legally binding prohibitions on torture. Just let me name a few of them. There's the United Nations Convention Against Torture, which we're a signatory of, and that's the language. Some of the key languages listed here on our textbook on page 402, where it says it's very blunt and very straightforward. It says you may never use torture according to this international agreement under any circumstances, no matter how extreme. So it says no exceptional circumstances whatsoever, whether a state of war or a threat of war, internal instability, or any other public emergency may be invoked as a justification of torture. So it says no exceptional circumstances at all allow you to use torture. You can't say, well, we are only doing it because we're at war, or we're only doing it because martial law has been declared, or the country's falling apart, or we have a public emergency. No such justification may be given under the United Nations Convention Against Torture. And that was ratified in 1987 under President Ronald Reagan. So for an international treaty to become a part of our domestic law, there's a very high bar in our system that has to be met. You have to have 2/3 of both houses of Congress plus the signature of the president. But that's something that we committed ourselves to under that administration and on going forward. There's also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's all members of the UN agree to as well. There's the Geneva Conventions. So the United States is a signatory to all of these, which means that it's illegal to torture for any reason, either abroad or in the United States. But obviously, we may not have always lived up to the standards that we committed ourselves to, as for example, under the George W. Bush administration, many people were detained at various places in theaters of war around the world and taken to, like, say, Guantanamo Bay or other black site prisons, where they were subjected to brutal treatment that many international monitors argue is equivalent to torture. I'm talking about, like, say, waterboarding people, denying them food or sleep, and other kind of tough and brutal methods of detainee treatment. Now, me, myself, I kind of find the ethical debate over torture a little bit frustrating, because I feel as though it's obviously something wrong. It's wrong to even torture animals that we would allow to be killed for food. So in my view, it's clearly wrong to do that to any human for any reason. maybe that's an aspect of my moral thinking that is not utilitarian in nature, because I cannot imagine, no matter how much benefit could be derived from the practice, that we would condone or permit that kind of treatment to be done to a human being. I mean, even in our United States Constitution, we have the Eighth Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment. So it seems like a fundamental fact about a civilized nation is that it shouldn't allow this form of corporal punishment to exist in the law. Maybe it's even worse than murder, according to some people's intuitions. But nonetheless, I want to at least mention one kind of hypothetical scenario that some authors present to try and give at least some theoretical justification for it. Sometimes people talk about the quote-unquote ticking time bomb scenario related to torture. So let me put that here. The ticking time bomb scenario. Now, it's a hypothetical scenario, meaning it's not real, but you can imagine maybe something like this being real. Suppose that we had a detainee in our custody, and we knew for a fact, somehow, that this person was aware of the location of a time bomb that was planted in some public area where it was densely populated. And if we don't find this time bomb in time, if it gets down to 0, then it's going to detonate and it's going to kill a whole bunch of innocent people. So we're just the authorities. We're trying to find out the location of the bomb. We have one guy in custody, and we know that he has the knowledge of its whereabouts. But let's suppose that he's not willing to divulge its, location. So he's not willing to. He's resistant to providing the information. But there's urgency because we're trying to save lives and not allow the bomb to blow. So imagine then that we thought the only way that we could coerce this person into providing the information that would allow us to, confiscate the bomb and evacuate the area around it. The only way that we might be willing to do it is if he's pressured by having torture applied to him. So some people think that in a case like that, although there's pain and misery and suffering, applied to the victim of torture, the benefit in terms of total lives saved is sufficient to overweigh the cost of, the loss of human happiness and harm. So, to promote the most overall happiness, which is the standard of ethics and utilitarian thought, we should go ahead and, torture this one person to save many others. But I find a lot of fault with this example. I think some of you may be able to see why, I don't know, but look at it. The example assumes that we know, as though like an omniscient God, that the person in custody has the certain knowledge of the whereabouts of the thing. But, if the person has denied knowledge of that, we're not entitled to presume that they have the knowledge despite their, claim. It has to be adjudicated in a court, and a person has a right to remain silent, So I feel that the system that would have to be instituted to allow this practice to happen would erode all of our civil liberties by giving the state the power to assume that a person's withholding information when they very well might not be. Also, there's a lot of evidence to show that when torture is actually used on people, it doesn't necessarily result in reliable or correct information. Because when one is tortured, the first thing they want is for the torture to stop. And so they'll basically come up with any statement that they think the interrogator wants in order to satisfy them to make the torture end. So in that case, it can lead to a lot of false confessions, people who actually have done nothing but would rather give a false confession than be subjected to further torment. So, there's a lot of issues with it. I feel even if it could justifiably achieve its goal, it would be enough of a violation of human rights and dignity that I would still find fault with it. But anyway, now that is all done, and with that much in place, we're going to finally move on to start talking about the first author in this unit of the course. So I need to actually get a quick paper towel to clear this off from the whiteboard, and I'll be right back. Okay. All right, guys. So I hope you just enjoy those introductory comments and examinations of the topic and a few related matters. But now we're moving on to this first big author on the topic of war. So this is Douglas Lackey. That's the philosopher's name. This is a paper written back in 1989, and it's in our book. And the paper is called simply just Pacifism. Pacifism by Douglas Lackey. So Lackey himself is a pacifist. He's a person who believes that war is always wrong. He's an anti-war pacifist, that we shouldn't engage in war. So pacifism can be thought of as people who are serious about the right to life. They don't take it for granted, and they don't even take the killing of soldiers for granted. If everybody has a right to life, they think that intentionally killing people is always immoral in every case, whether the person is a soldier or not. They would mention, for example, that many people who claim to be pro-life are not anti-war. If you're pro-life, you don't believe that human life should be destroyed. But how could you then be supportive of war, which we know it kills not just fetuses, but full-on adult human beings and mature human beings? Some critics of the pacifist position will, of course, oppose this viewpoint by saying that if you cared that much about life, and if it's that important to you that it not be destroyed, then wouldn't it be a contradiction or hypocritical to say we should not defend people's lives if the only available means to do so were to use lethal force? But anyway, with that as our background, we're turning straight into Douglas Lackey's article, simply entitled Pacifism. And when we finish with him in the next lectures that I post, you'll see the opposite side of this argument. There's a guy named Jan, I'm not sure if it's a Swedish type of pronunciation, but Jan, Jan Narveson, rather. And he criticizes the pacifist position. So Lackey, he supports pacifism. Narveson opposes the pacifists. And we'll hear both sides of the argument like we always do in this class. So the first thing Lackey says in his paper is that pacifism has actually got several different kinds. His first goal for the reader is to try and distinguish these different types of pacifism. But before he gets to the different types, he wants to make one quick point in the preliminary. He says there's a certain version of quote-unquote pacifism that he does not think is actually a true moral position. So what he calls that version of pacifism that doesn't even really count as a moral view is what he calls live and let live pacifism. So let me put the definition or concept of that here. I can clear away his name. I think by now that's known. So he starts by saying live and let live pacifism is not a true moral position. So here's one claim. So claim of the author, to get us going, it says, live and let live pacifism, in like little air quotes, that is not a true moral position. So to understand his point here, we need to think and understand what is this concept of live and let live pacifism, and why is it not a moral position? Okay, so let me put the definition of so-called live and let live pacifism here in our other typed out live chat. Okay. Live and let live pacifism. It's this type of outlook. It's the viewpoint that while I will refuse to use violence or kill, if other people do it, I'm not going to judge them for not being a pacifist. So it's a person who says, I prefer not to use violence or force, but if others do it, I will respect their decision to be that way. So it's kind of like live and let live, different strokes for different folks. I don't want to use violence and etc. But if other people do it, I'm not going to judge them for that. I'm not going to criticize them for that. Okay, so live and let live pacifism. Okay, I put it there in the chat, and what it says is live and let live pacifism, definition. One who says that while they will not use violence or kill, they will not criticize others who do so. Okay, but why is that not truly a moral position? Well, let's just repeat the point and make sure it's all clear. The person who's live and let live pacifist says while they're personally opposed to killing and violence, they don't want to impose that code on anyone else, and they won't, like, say, judge or condemn other people for not being pacifists. But what does that really mean? For that person, pacifism is not really a moral standpoint, but rather a lifestyle choice or preference. It's not the same thing as having a moral position. Because, right, when you think something's wrong, answer this question. If you think something's actually wrong, then you think it's wrong for who to do it? Just you? No, that doesn't make sense. If you think, like, say, that the act of rape is wrong, and I hope that we could agree that that's something that is wrong, right? If you think rape is wrong, does that mean that you just don't want to do it, but if other people do it, you're like, fine, I mean, I'm not going to condemn them. That's just a different person. They can make their own choices. No, if you think it's wrong, then it's wrong for you, but also for anyone else to do it. It's something that you can criticize and condemn no matter who does it, because that you judge it's morally wrong, not just not to your liking. If I told you that I like vanilla ice cream, but you don't have to like it. If you want to eat chocolate or strawberry and that's your favorite, go right ahead. That's not a moral position, though. That's just a preference. It's a matter of taste. When I say something's wrong, though, it's not supposed to be that I will accept other people doing this thing. If it's wrong, then it's wrong to me to see anybody do it. So I'll put that point here as well in the chat. Okay, so I put here below, to say that X is wrong implies that it is wrong for anybody to do it. So to those that say, I just don't like using violence, it makes me feel like bad or it's gross, but if other people do it, I'm going to stand back and accept what they're doing. That person doesn't really feel that it's wrong. They just must not prefer it for themselves. But to think something's wrong, again, is to judge that it's wrong for everyone. So if you say that it's wrong to do something, but it does not matter if other people do it, then you're contradicting yourself and you're confused about the whole idea of what right and wrong mean. Right and wrong doesn't just mean go ahead and do it if you want to. It's just not my thing. It means that you don't believe anyone should be doing that. So for pacifism to truly be a moral position, it has to be prescribed for all people, not just for oneself. Again, moral codes are not the same as personal preferences and lifestyle choices. If I like one genre of music and you don't, I'm not saying you're a bad person because you don't like it. I may think you don't have great taste, but it's not the same thing as making a claim that you're doing something evil, unethical, or wrong. So again, to say it's wrong for you to do something personally is to say it would also be wrong for everyone else to do it. So now that we know that that's not the real form of pacifism, he goes forward and now he actually tries to lay out what are like the authentic, real versions of pacifism that there are to choose from. And Lackey, the author, he says there's actually 4 main types of pacifism. So we're going to put those up here and talk about them next. Okay, so 4 different types of pacifism. Okay, so the first one, he doesn't give like as much of a clear label for it, so I'm going to kind of give a label to make it something memorable. Let's suppose the first one is known as anti-killing pacifism, where that's the main point of this kind. Anti-killing pacifism is just the view that it's wrong to kill specifically. So that's the thing that's wrong according to this variety of pacifists. The killing is the wrong thing. So it's wrong to kill. That's not the only possible type. So here's another type that's listed just afterwards. Next, he talks about one that he calls universal pacifism. Universal pacifism goes more beyond just killing and says that it's wrong to use violence at all in general, whether it's lethal violence or even just more minor forms of violence. It's always wrong to use violence in general. So universal pacifism, it is wrong to use violence in general. So I guess it's called the universal pacifism because it's saying like universally, like all violence is wrong. It's not just those that end up killing people. To think about universal pacifism, you can think about the sort of principled nonviolent resistance of like Martin Luther King or Gandhi. In the case of Martin Luther King, many people that followed his methodology of nonviolent resistance would be getting, like, say, like attacked by dogs, hosed down by fire hoses during the civil rights era, trying to break up marches for civil rights. But they didn't retaliate with force. Instead, the courage of their convictions were shown by their willingness to suffer pain and abuse in order to present this issue to the public and bring consciousness to it. So those that believe violence in all forms is wrong are in the universal pacifist camp. Another type, a third type, he calls private pacifism. Private pacifism means that you believe that personal violence is always wrong, like interpersonally, doing it as an individual or a private citizen perhaps, but you'd be willing to grant that perhaps political violence could be justified. So personal violence is always wrong. But political violence can be okay. So let me explain that more once I write it. It says personal violence is always wrong, but political violence can be okay. So this type of view says that you should never engage in violence in your private capacity as an individual. So you shouldn't, like, get into fights, start throwing hands or use weapons. Just stay nonviolent in your personal life. But if you are signed up for the military or the police or the National Guard, right, and now you are empowered by the state to officially act in a violent way under certain proper conditions, like you're apprehending a suspect or you're trying to, I don't know, defuse an attack that a criminal is making against someone else. In cases like that, you may say that now the use of violence becomes authorized. So when you're given a grant of authority by the state. There's a saying that some people have, which is that the state has a monopoly on the justified use of force, which would be somewhat in line with this, that it's always wrong to use violence and force unless you're authorized to do so in some official capacity by the color of law. So that's the private pacifist position. And then the fourth type of pacifism is one that we've talked about already, and that's just anti-war pacifism, which says that personal violence is sometimes okay, but political violence is always wrong. So let me just add that here to the top. Anti-war pacifism. So political violence is always wrong. But personal violence can be okay. Okay, so the anti-war pacifist is opposed to using violence in a way that's undertaken by the state politically in case of, say, war. But they would grant that if you're, say, using self-defense to just protect yourself as an individual, that can be morally justified. So it's kind of like the converse of the private pacifist who says the reverse, that it's personal violence that's wrong, but political violence that can be justified. These folks say, no, don't join the military or whatever and fight in a war. But if you have to defend yourself or your family, maybe that could be okay. So different viewpoints on pacifism, what its scope is, when it should be done, or if it's always the case. Now, from here, the next section of the author's paper tries to offer support for a moral prohibition on killing. So he tries to now give standard reasons that might be offered as justification or defense for being a pacifist. You might be wondering, like, what is it that inspires or makes somebody consider pacifism as their view? And the author Lackey wants to try and make some points that could lead somebody to agree with him that pacifism is the right moral standpoint to go with. So now that's what we're going to turn our attention to. What are different reasons that are given in support of pacifism. Okay, so I'm going to clear this so that I can write those points down. Okay, so reasons to be a pacifist. Again, all according to the author from the textbook that we have. So his first reason that a general person might have to kind of side with pacifism is what he refers to as the biblical prohibition. The biblical prohibition on killing. Okay, so we're talking now about the Bible, the Christian Bible, or at least the Old Testament, which is also revered as the sacred text of Judaism. In its description as the Torah is really identical or equivalent to the Old Testament Christian Bible. Also, Muslims, the third member of the Abrahamic triad of religions, does grant religious authority to the Old Testament scriptures too. So in the Old Testament, we all know, probably many of us know, that there's a very straightforward statement in the Ten Commandments, which says, "Thou shalt not kill." So based on that, you might say, God has commanded you not to kill. It's stated bluntly. It's stated with no qualification. It doesn't say, "Thou shalt not kill," for the most part, or "Thou shalt not kill," unless you really have to. It just says directly and with no ambiguity that you should not kill, that you shall not kill, as a commandment from God. And so you might think then that if God is the author of right and wrong, and it's his commandments that a person is bound to follow to be a good human being, then maybe you shouldn't kill just to live the life God commands you to live. But of course, even though the biblical prohibition has that sort of general appeal, we can mention here some criticisms with it. So as I'm talking about all the different reasons to be a pacifist that he lays out, we also have to speak about what the opponent might say in reaction to some of these claims. So you heard the view that the Bible says "Thou shalt not kill," so that's why you ought to be a pacifist. But what about objections? Okay, so one objection or criticism is this. Maybe what about the translation from ancient Hebrew into English? So the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew. And some people think that the translation of that passage that says "you shall not kill" into English could have a little bit of ambiguity in terms of what the correct translation is. Some people think that the real meaning of "thou shalt not kill" would be better interpreted as "thou shalt not murder." And that might give a little bit more leeway, because murder is not just any act of killing, but it's wrongful killing. So if it's "thou shalt not murder," then maybe the prohibition is not against every single case of killing, but only against those that are somehow described as wrongful. Additionally, another feature that makes this somewhat, at least, subject to objection or criticism is that although it says in that part of the Old Testament, "Thou shalt not kill," there are many other passages in the same Bible that order people to kill, at least under certain conditions. So if I'm reading it from page 407 of our textbook, just as another example, it says here, Exodus 22:18, the scripture says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," meaning that if you have a witch, then God commands you to kill the witch. Leviticus 24:16, "He that blasphemeth the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death, and all the congregation shall stone him." So that says that, blaspheming the name of the Lord should be punished by death too. It also says, "He that killeth any man shall surely be put to death," Leviticus 24:17. So, does it mean then that we're not supposed to ever kill, or are we supposed to under these conditions? The Bible itself seems to be a little bit unclear on the point because it's somewhat inconsistent. Now, another, of course, obvious objection to this basis for pacifism is that it only really could possibly appeal to who? Clearly, it could only appeal to people who already have the belief in God, or maybe even just one of those Abrahamic religions. But not everybody is a believer of the Bible, and not everybody even believes that God exists. Majority of people do, but a growing religious identification in this country and around the world is non-religious. And to those folks, they would say, why should I follow these statements anyway? Are they really the word of God, or is there no such thing? And even if you believe that it was the word of God, some people have questions as to whether the word of God is something that everybody has to obey, or whether it's only specific to the members of a given religion. So that's one issue to raise, but that's at least one basis in favor of pacifism. So, some people are conscientious objectors. There sometimes are people that hold powerful religious objections to participation in war, and that's for some people the main reason that drives them in that direction. But let's speak about another reason. Another reason given to be a pacifist by the author is the sacredness of life. Sacredness of life. Okay, so this one might not necessarily have to refer to a religious basis, because whether you're a religious person or you're just a secular type non-religious person, I think we can all respect and understand, because we're alive, how amazing it is to be alive and how much value there is vested in the concept of life itself. When you see things living, when you see all the beautiful works of nature and animals and forests and human civilizations across the globe, it's a feeling of awe and beauty that you can derive from all that. The complexity of all these living things, big and small, from the tiniest insects to the biggest, blue whales or whatever. And the feeling of respect and reverence for the living things around the planet lead many people to say that life is sacred and therefore we should never destroy life. Look out at the universe, and I mean, maybe there's life somewhere else, but as far as we know, we haven't seen it yet. It could be that this special little planet that we're on houses this amazing thing where there's not just objects and there's not just inanimate matter, but there's things that can feel, think, perceive, and have a perspective on the world. So if life is that important and so sacred, then maybe that's why some say we shouldn't be killing things that are alive. Now, different kinds of pacifism can be derived from this feeling that life is sacred. The most extreme form would forbid killing any living thing, even like, say, bugs. And there are some sects of Hinduism that actually follow that idea, including Jainism, which is one of them. A less extreme view that holds this position might allow at least the killing of plants, but maybe not insects and other life forms. And the more moderate version of this would permit the killing of animals, non-human animals, but not human beings. So anyway, the justification has some, I think, appeal, because I know most all of us are probably disgusted by images of things dying or being killed. But a problem is this. What could be an objection to that? One problem is that, again, if life is that sacred and that makes somebody want to never kill anything, then the whole premise behind the position is that life is valuable and it ought to be preserved to the maximum degree possible. But sometimes, wouldn't it be the only available means to preserve as much life as possible to actually use lethal force? Because if it's wrong to kill because life is good and sacred, that means that by killing, something good is destroyed. So wouldn't it be permissible to do something that would result in less overall loss of life, even if, somewhat ironically, it involved the destruction of some living beings? So like, if you don't kill this person that's on the loose, maybe they're going to kill 100 more, or maybe that's the only way to stop them from an ongoing act of lethal violence. So there's that issue. Another problem with the case made by this point is that if life was that sacred, then we would probably have a moral objection to people who even place the sacred life at risk. So think of thrill seekers who, maybe climb mountains free climbing without ropes, or engage in other risky behavior like, I don't know, off-road racing or something at high speeds without, too much concern for the accident that could happen. Oftentimes, we don't say these people are doing anything evil, even though they're not taking all available means to secure their life from possible death or injury. So, and when a person goes out and fights and dies in a noble cause, we call them a martyr. We don't say, well, they did something terrible by allowing themselves to lose their lives. Well, what about another justification? Another justification is simply the right to life itself. The right to life could perhaps bypass some of the utilitarian style objections that this one faced, which was, if you could save more lives by killing one, then wouldn't it be better in terms of the overall preservation of life to take the lethal action? Well, if life is based on having a right to be alive, then rights trump utility, as has been argued by other ethicists. And if rights trump utility, then you would say that it would never be okay to kill a person to save more lives, because their life has a right to be preserved, not just something that you can weigh against maximizing the number of people surviving. But again, critics of this view will return to a similar point as we've seen in previous criticisms, that when you have a right to something, that should imply the moral permissibility of defending that right against unjust aggression waged against it. So now we've talked about reasons in favor of being a pacifist. The next section of his article goes a little even further and tries to speak about reasons to be specifically an anti-war pacifist. So that brand of pacifism, what would be a good basis or reason to side with it? And so that's what we'll talk about next. Reasons to be one of the anti-war pacifists who says it's always wrong to participate or wage war. So okay, so the first reason that he gives is perhaps not the one that you'd think is the most obvious, but he starts with it, and it's because of the killing of soldiers in war. It's not the best pen, sorry. Nor is this one. Okay. But I think you can read that anyway. The killing of soldiers, that's one reason that some people would say that you should not be willing to participate in or support war, because it kills soldiers. In all wars, some number of soldiers are killed. Many people think that's acceptable because maybe it's a just war and they're fighting in a way that's morally justified because it meets all those conditions. Other people might say, hey, even if the war is not just, it's still morally acceptable for war to kill soldiers because it's honorable for people to fight to defend their country. But the anti-war pacifist doesn't bow to that point. They don't take the killing of anyone for granted, including the killing of soldiers. And they would say that such killing, even when it's targeting soldiers, is intentional violation of their right to life. Now, the reply, let me talk about a reply to this. The reply is that killing in war is usually a matter of self-defense. And even the anti-war pacifist acknowledges that private defense of oneself is okay. So let's talk about an objection to that. So what I wrote is killing in war. This is a reaction to this. This is like a critic coming back against that point. So let's focus on the structure, the logic. Lackey's trying to state out reasons that might be given to be an anti-war pacifist. And one reason is that it kills soldiers. But here's his opponent's critique. Well, even though soldiers are killed in war, when that happens, it's because people are just defending themselves against those soldiers. Shouldn't that be morally permissible to defend yourself when you're in war, to defend your own life? But he says no. He's got a reply to the objection. Okay, so here's Lackey's reply to that objection. So point, counterpoint, rebuttal. Here's the reply. He says you can only really make a legitimate claim of self-defense if two things are true. Two conditions have to be met for a legitimate claim of self-defense. So actually, let me move this over to the left a little bit so I have plenty of room. Reply. You can only legitimately claim self-defense if, okay, number one, You have no other way to save your life except by killing. No other way to save your life except killing. And the second requirement for there to be a legitimate case for self-defense is that you did not do anything to provoke the attack that you're defending from. You did nothing to provoke the attack you are defending against. Okay, a little running out of room, but I want to get it all in there. Against. Okay, so reading this off so that you can clearly understand what's written. Why be an anti-war pacifist? Well, first reason, because soldiers get killed in war. But here's the point of his opponent. Well, even though that's true, it's a matter of self-defense, and that's normally fair and reasonable. But the response back is, no, you can only legitimately claim self-defense if, first of all, you have no other way to save your life except if you killed, and second of all, if you didn't do anything to provoke the attack that you're now defending against. And Lackey says that these two are generally not satisfied by soldiers that use lethal force in modern warfare. So let's talk about why not. First of all, you have no other way to save your life except by killing. Well, his response to that one is maybe not as strong as his response to the second, but he says that there are ways to avoid to save your life without killing. In some cases, you can surrender and become a prisoner of war, and in that case, the protocols for the laws of war internationally would be that you'd be taken in as a prisoner of war, detained until the conclusion of hostilities, and then let go. But in a more specific response to this that I think is a little bit better, he also mentions that in modern day warfare, it's not often that you're killing in kill or be killed scenarios like hand-to-hand combat where unless I kill this person right in front of me, he's imminently going to take my life. Oftentimes in modern war, weapons are launched from safe launching points where you're not at any immediate risk of death. So people can be firing off missiles from behind fortified walls, from fortified compounds, and increasingly in the modern day, we are able to launch munitions from remote places that are far, far away using drones. Sometimes there may be a person launching weapons from a whole other country as they operate an unmanned aerial drone in a far-off theater of war. So that kind of undermines the point that the person that's using this force has got to kill in order to save their life. If you're sitting comfortably in a safe military compound, not at imminent risk of death, then the claim of self-defense starts to kind of become a little bit, untrue or hollow. So if it was really self-defense, maybe yeah. But he's making the point that in modern warfare, it's often not the case that you're face-to-face in a kill or be killed scenario. About the second point, suppose that there is the aggressor nation that's taking the war to another country. If they are bringing the war to the other country and then they're threatened by soldiers that are just fighting back, then they can't really claim self-defense when they try to respond to these threats from the soldiers whose nation they're invading. Because it's like, who started the fight, basically? If you start the fight, then you can't exactly claim self-defense when you kill the person who fights back against you, okay? Like, what if I walked up to a person on the street and I stabbed them in the arm and they're like, holy crap, like I'm bleeding. And so they think I need to attack this person that stabbed me in the arm. So now they come at me with a rage, with a self-defensive mindset, right? Do I now have the justification to kill them because they're threatening my life? I mean, follow the narrative, right? I'm the one that attacked them first. So of course I provoked their hostilities against me. In that case, I'm the true aggressor, and my claim of self-defense subsequent to their response would be illegitimate. So when you provoke the attack that you then claim self-defense to defend from, it's really not true that you're the defensive party. And in the case of the United States, anyway, our nation, we are definitely not going to probably be invaded by a foreign adversary because of the massive power our military has. So when we have fought wars, going back for generations, it's been our military deployed on foreign shores to fight those wars over there. And that means that when we touch down with our weapons and with our military members, we're provoking a hostile response from the nations that we occupy. In that case, how much legitimacy could there be to any claim of true self-defense? Because first off, in many cases, we're not at imminent threat of death when the weapons are launched. And in the second case, we could be seen as the aggressor, therefore provoking hostilities that we can't really quite claim our self-defense to respond back against. Now, another objection to this point could be this one. So objection number 2, second objection to this basis for being an anti-war pacifist, that don't the soldiers assume the risks associated with war by enlisting in the first place? So don't they choose to put themselves at risk of death, knowing what they're signing up for, knowing that it might result in their death? So they waive their right to life by assuming the risks of military service. So another objection to that. I'll erase this objection, and there's commentary that follows so I can make more room. So the second objection would be the soldiers that are killed in war have waived their right to life by assuming the risks of military service. Okay, so another objection or pushback against this idea that war is wrong because soldiers are killed could be this point, all right? You might argue, well, no, it's not wrong because the soldiers are killed in war. They've chosen on their own to give up their right to life. If they wanted to have the normal right to life that we have as civilians, the right to not be killed, then they would never have entered into the military and fought in a war. But, if you fight in war, you know that you make yourself a legitimate target of an enemy, and therefore the right to life that you would have in peacetime conditions has been set aside so that you can participate in war. What about that? Does that make it such that the killing of soldiers is morally legitimate in war? Well, he has replies to this too. Okay, so let's get into his reply to that point. His reply to the current objection is that in modern day war around the world, many of the armies, most of them are not all volunteer armies. So most militaries around the world are not volunteer armed forces. Only wealthy nations like the United States can afford to have an all-volunteer military. We used to have a draft. It was active up until Vietnam. But because of the massive unpopularity of people being drafted into service and dying for war that didn't want to fight in, we've pretty much gone away from that practice, although, it's theoretically conceivable that if there was a bad enough war that there could be a draft process instituted again. Anyway, though, it hasn't been the norm since the 70s, so for 50 years we've not had such a thing as a draft, even though we've fought in several conflicts, including, the more recent Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. But it's only wealthy nations, again, that can afford to offer the incentives so that there will be enough people enlisting to staff a full-on military force. Most countries around the world which don't have those kinds of resources have to coerce people into joining by involuntarily drafting them, meaning conscription. So the point here is that the soldiers have chosen to give up their right to life by deciding to enter the military. But if they have not volunteered for their service, then they never made a willful or free choice. They were compelled to do it against penalty of, incarceration or whatever. So the argument that people have freely assumed the risks of military service, thus knowing full well that their right to life would be waived, would not apply, at least for the majority of militaries that exist in the world, which are not themselves all volunteer. And he has a second point of response to this as well. So a second reply is just this. I'll put it here in this chat to create the room. Reply number 2 to this current point, so hopefully you'll know the context for it as you look at the chat comments. But the second one is that usually when a risk is realized, responsibility for the bad outcome lies primarily with those that create the risk, not those who assume the risk. So okay, so I put there the point of this reply, and I put an example below that I'll talk about just now. So keep in mind, he says soldiers killed in war could be a valid reason that you should be an anti-war pacifist. Aside from the first objection and reply that we already dealt with, there's another objection. Some may say, well, the soldiers have given up their right to life on purpose by choosing to enter the war, knowing that that means they may be killed. His response is, most militaries are not volunteer. A second response is the one here in this chat, which is that, well, when something risky ends up resulting in something bad, who gets the most blame for the bad outcome? Is it the person who creates the risk, or is it those who assume the risk? And he thinks it has more to do with those that actually create the risk in the first place. So here's an example that is used to make the point. Suppose that there's an arsonist out there. So by definition, they're setting fires to public places. They set a fire and it ends up catching onto someone's home. Now their house is on fire. So that's not good. This person is safely outside of the house, but there are items inside, maybe pets, maybe heirlooms, maybe precious family belongings they don't want to lose. So they take a risk to go inside of that burning home to retrieve the items, knowing it might end up that they die. Suppose that, as bad luck has it, this poor person does suffer a death while trying to retrieve those items from the burning home. Now, that was a risk, and this is a risk that resulted in the bad outcome of their death. Hypothetical situation, right? But who would get the most blame for this death? Is it the person that chose to run into the building, or is the person who set the fire in the first place? The author's point is that there's blame to go around, but there's probably more blame that we can assign to the person who set the fire in the first place, because the risk simply wouldn't have even existed for anybody to have assumed if that event didn't occur first. So by parallel, if we're a nation like the United States that visits another country with our military and starts to invade and fight a war there, we're creating the conditions of war. And suppose then that there are people who choose to fight in the military, and let's suppose they were not drafted, but they chose to do it of their own free will because they want to now serve to defend in their community against what they perceive as a foreign threat. Well, they've assumed risks, haven't they? Now they're putting themselves in the line of fire against our soldiers and our military. They have assumed a risk. But who created the risk in the first place if we're the ones that have, prosecuted war against another country? In the same sense, we'd be like the arsonist here by parallel, and the people fighting back would be like those assuming risks. Have they assumed the risks? Yes. Does that make it at least more possible that they could get hurt? Yes, also. But who's to blame mostly for the fact that there's any risk in the first place? It's the nation that created conditions of war. So he has those different responses to any objections given against the killing of soldiers as a major reason to be an anti-war pacifist. So we talk now about that reason, different objections, and his, I think, noble attempt to bat away the objections with fair rebuttals. But there's one or two more points to add to this. So another reason to be an anti-war pacifist, this one I think even maybe a little bit easier to argue for, the killing of civilians. Some of the objections about why it's bad that soldiers are killed might have spoken to you. Certainly I find favor with some of them. But this one is a little bit more tragic. I mean, civilians are people that are not in the military. We're talking about non-combatants, just people, families, moms, dads, children, grandparents, not fighting in war, just living their lives, but somehow being in the threat of violence because they're caught up in the crossfire of military operations that are happening in their country. In ancient wars, before we had more modern standards of warfare, war was much more total, including the killing of all, rape, pillage, plunder, scorched earth tactics. Now, war is still ugly and terrible, but there has been at least some sense of civilizing trends that have attempted to try and confine warfare more and more only to those that are combatants. But obviously, it's impossible to isolate only the combatants when it comes to using lethal weapons. And therefore, we know in advance that some number of innocent civilians will die as collateral damage when the war happens. If we know that beforehand, wouldn't that be intentionally killing the innocent, which we all know is wrong? To the pacifist, such death of the innocent as occurs in war is immoral. To the non-pacifist, they're regrettable, but they don't see it as murder because it wasn't the intended outcome, just a foreseeable negative side effect of the real thing you're trying to do, which was attack military targets. But again, the pacifists ask, why wouldn't we call that murder? The people that are innocent are being killed, and you know in war in advance that some will die, so why is that not murder? Now, a non-pacifist may try to object to this by saying that it's not too much different, the dynamic described by war and the way that civilians are sometimes killed in it. It's not too much different from the result of certain policies that we institute, which have a similar effect, knowing in advance that if we adopt these policies, it will cause some innocent people to die, but we don't find moral fault with these actions. For example, what if we impose a higher speed limit on the roads, right? So legislators get up in Congress and they decide cars are getting faster, people want to get from point A to B faster, so the speed limit used to be 55 miles per hour, let's upgrade it to 65 miles per hour. Now, when that law is passed, the legislators know in advance that, well, one good thing that will be achieved by the law is people will have more, they will be permitted to more quickly arrive at their destination because they'll be allowed to travel that much faster on the roads. So that's the intended goal. But there will also be this negative side effect that will be a byproduct of allowing that higher speed limit to be permitted, which is that it's going to also result in more dangerous accidents and collisions and maybe more fatalities on the road. So in advance, they know that if this law is passed, it's going to cause some additional number of deaths and injuries. So does that make this law immoral? Most of us would say no, because the intention of the law is simply to expedite people's travel. It's a negative and foreseeable side effect of it that some people will die as a byproduct, but since that's not the goal or aim, it's considered to be a morally justified but unintentional side effect. Now, in a way, you could say that's similar to the killing of civilians in war. You know in advance that some of the civilians will die, but that's not really the cause that you're fighting for the sake of. You're just trying to fight to restore peace for your own country and to, defuse the military threat from the opposing military. You may know that some of the civilians will be killed, but since it's not your goal, how's that any different from this other kind of policy that we tolerate or permit and do not criticize it as immoral, which again achieves and advances one goal, but has a sort of unfortunate side effect that's not the intended outcome of causing a certain number of deaths. Well, what's his response to that example? His response is that the case of this type of policy and going to war, they're not alike in one morally significant way. So in the policy case of, say, the upgraded speed limits, the rules that are being instituted are agreed to by the affected population, at least indirectly through the democratic process. Okay, so the laws that are formed in our, let's say, Congress, it's not like we don't have any impact on what those laws will be, because we, after all, are the voters who have chosen to elect those representatives who are going to make decisions on our behalf. If we really didn't like the upgraded speed limits, then in theory, we could all get together, mobilize a political coalition, lobby for the cause, and try to vote out all the legislators that promise to do that, or to vote in new legislators that promise to reduce the speed limit. But since we're not doing that, it seems that we are choosing collectively to bear the risks that are borne by the institution of such laws. That means that we consent to the risks that we face through these laws that are established, through our participation in the democratic system. But the civilian victims of war that are caught up in the crossfire of warring militaries, they don't get to make any direct or indirect choice to expose themselves to these risks for the sake of some self-perceived benefit. So the public in a democratic society assumes the risk collectively of whatever harms may befall us from raising speed limits, for example. But The civilian victims of war do not legitimately assume any such risk when war just descends upon them despite their protests. Some people may say, well, if they continue to live in the war zone and they don't just, become refugees or evacuate from the whole country, then maybe they're choosing to assume that risk too. But this is also not a fair point because it would require so much sacrifice for you to actually live as a refugee. You'd have to uproot yourself from your community, from your home, from your family, from your friends, from your nation and its government and laws. So you can't just say that people who refuse to do that have made a free choice to stay in harm's way, and therefore we shouldn't be, judging the fact or morally condemning the fact that some of them would die in war. Now, the third reason to be a pacifist, an anti-war pacifist that he gives. So we talked about the killing of soldiers and why there's back and forth as to why that's a good reason, the killing of civilians, and also why there's a little back and forth on that point. Now we finish with this, the balance of good and evil in war. And so this last reason to be an anti-war pacifist is explicitly utilitarian in nature, because it just tries to say that if you look through history, you will never see a war that had more, on balance, benefit compared to the harm. That it's always been just a bunch of harm, death, and destruction for no significant benefit. And in that case, you'd say it's just a utilitarian losing proposition to fight wars, because it's going to cause a lot of harm and damage to overall human happiness, and it's not going to be compensated for by any significant gains in overall human happiness. Pacifists will say that there's never been a war that has had the right balance of good and evil. Non-pacifists may try to say no, that there are examples of wars that achieved great goods, and that might have justified those cases. But the pacifists, like at least Douglas Lackey, our author here, he denies that. He says there's never really been any great good achieved in war. And what he finishes the paper with is, I thought, a pretty bold section where he tries to point out that even wars that we generally celebrate in our own culture and history, the wars that we think of as like good wars, where as much damage and harm as it caused, it was justified by the immense positive value of the results. He takes aim at some of those. So some of our most historically cherished wars, sorry, yeah, and he just tries to make the case that even those could be viewed through a critical lens and seen somewhat differently as not having really achieved enough good to have made it worth it. So let me talk to you about his claims about some of these different wars. He starts off by talking about, let's see here. So there's the Mexican-American War, okay? Happened over 150 years, around 150 years ago. It says here, so in that war, half of Mexico was transferred to American rule. Like, that's the state of California where we're in right now. Like, most all of this was just part of Mexico in the past. And territory got annexed by the United States and turned into just a larger territorial landmass of the continental United States. Or I should say the contiguous United States. Now, we may think, oh, that was a great thing. It established these changed borders and it gave bigger landmass to the United States. But it wasn't a moral good that this happened. It caused a lot of death and destruction. But what would have been the case if we had never fought the war? It would have just been redrawn borders. There would have been a bigger Mexico and a smaller United States. But you can't say that anything evil happened, that anything evil was prevented by fighting the war that we fought, as it says here in the book. According to anti-war pacifists, the amount of moral good produced by war is greatly exaggerated. The Mexican War, for example, resulted in half of Mexico being transferred to American rule. This was great for the United States, but not morally great, since the United States had no claim to the territory, and no great injustice would have happened if the war had not been fought at all. So if we didn't fight the war, we wouldn't have had these redrawn borders, but there would have been a lot more people that never got killed, shot, or destroyed in the violence that ensued from the war. So in his view, it's no moral good that was achieved by that war necessarily in comparison to the moral harm. What about the Revolutionary War of America? That's one that I know our history books really cherish, and we were always told, Paul Revere came and said the redcoats are coming, and we fought back against tyranny and against King George III, and we wanted no taxation without representation, and to practice freedom of religion from the Anglican Church and stuff. But hold on. What would have happened if we didn't fight in the Revolutionary War? Well, not every British colony that established a new country was disloyal to the monarch. Canada, for example, remained loyal, unlike the United States. So maybe our history and trajectory historically would have mapped out a little more closely to the way Canada's project played out if we had not fought in the Revolutionary War. But when we look at our neighbors to the north, we don't think, oh my God, I'm so glad we avoided their status quo by fighting the Revolutionary War and not remaining loyal to the Brits. It's not like they're suffering from some type of terrible status quo that our efforts allowed us to avoid. And that's what it says in the book. The Revolutionary War in America is widely viewed as a war that produced a great moral good. But if the war had not been fought, the history of the United States would be similar to the history of Canada, which did remain loyal. And no one feels that the Canadians have suffered or are suffering great injustices that the American colonies avoided by war. Then they talk about World War I. That's an easy one, I think, to point out, because most even historians, I think, agree that it was just a big stalemate. It was the first time in modern history that we were starting to use some of the more advanced weapons systems that now are coming into production, like tanks and gas and, aviation to drop bombs from the sky, landmines and everything else. So the devastation was massive, and it involved so many different countries with no clear winner in the end. So I think it's easy to point out that maybe World War I was a mistake. It just caused a lot of death and destruction for no clear benefit or advantage to anyone. What about World War II, though? That is widely regarded as like the good war, the war where the Allies fought and destroyed Nazi Germany and the Axis powers were defeated. The imperial ambitions of Nazis at the time could have been to expand their fascist regime broadly across Europe and the rest of the world, and maybe to annihilate the Jews. So wasn't it worthwhile in that case, at least? But even here, he doesn't budge, and he says, if you want to be critical enough, you can say maybe no great good was achieved by the way that the war was fought. And he says this. This brings me head to head with World War II. It's commonly estimated that 35 million people died as a result of World War II. It's difficult to imagine that any cause could justify 35 million deaths, but unfortunately, the Allies only need to justify their share of the killings. Between 1939 and 1945, Allied forces killed about 5.5 million Axis soldiers and about 1 million civilians in Axis countries. The Axis is the name of the powers that were aligned with Germany at the time. Suppose Britain and the United States had chosen to stay out of World War II, and suppose that Stalin had, like Lenin, surrendered to Germany shortly after the invasion. Does avoiding the world that would have resulted from these choices justify killing 6.5 million people? Well, if Hitler had won the war, doubtless they would have killed a great many people both before and after victory. But it's quite likely that the total of additional victims beyond those they killed in the war that was fought would have been less than 6.5 million. And at any rate, the responsibility for those deaths would fall on Hitler, not on the Allies. If Hitler had won the war, large portions of the world may have fallen under foreign domination, perhaps for quite a while. But the anti-war pacifist would point out that the main areas of Axis domination, China and Russia, were not places in which the citizens enjoyed a high level of freedom before the war began to begin with. Perhaps the majority of people in the conquered areas would have worked out accords with their new rulers, as did the majority of French citizens during German occupation. But it cannot be argued that World War II was needed to save 6 million Jews from annihilation in the Holocaust, since in fact the war did not save them, because that number of Jews were killed, regardless of our efforts to intervene. So, I don't think I would necessarily agree with his final conclusions about the balance of good and evil in some of these wars, particularly maybe World War II, because of the supreme value of, having a victorious outcome against the Axis powers. But he makes his case, and it shows you that there's a way of looking at history that would be a little bit more willing to judge critically some of the even most popular wars, not to mention the ones that are more easy to criticize. Vietnam, where just a lot of death and destruction, and we didn't really achieve anything of great or lasting value. And World War I, another good example. But that's everything then for today. So we've learned from one author, Douglas Lackey, his argument for pacifism and anti-war pacifism. Next, on the next lecture that I post, we'll be looking at the opposite viewpoint from Jan Narveson and his position against pacifism and why he thinks pacifism is not a coherent position, why he opposes it. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for attending and watching. I'll post those next couple lectures around Wednesday night. But for now, just have a good one, and I hope you're doing well as everything else is going into class. I'll be finished grading the midterms by the end of this week, so hang in there, and I'll be in touch with each student individually to give you your score and comments But for now, I'm signing off. So thank you so much, and I'll see you soon. Okay, bye.